We're going to start this morning by talking about the education and the end of men. Our panel today includes some really terrific scholars. First up is going to be Dr. Anthony Rayo, who is a psychologist. He worked for more than 20 years at the Department of Psychiatry at Children's Hospital here in Boston, and he served as an instructor at the Harvard Medical School before founding Behavioral Solutions, which is a therapy practice here in the Boston area. And he's the author in 2010 of The Way of Boys, Promoting the Social and Emotional Development of Young Boys with HarperCollins.
Good morning, one and all, and it is absolutely terrific for me to be here. Appreciate it so much, and I'm excited to be kicking off this morning with the education panel. From my perspective as a child psychologist, I'm wondering if I should think of a new title instead of The End of Men. Is it The End of Boys or Boyhood? I have a unique historical perspective. I began seeing my first cases in 1985. And sure, at that time we saw a lot of boys referred to various clinics and places that I worked or trained at and later supervised at. But over the years, more and more boys were getting referred to us and also in our practices. And we're being diagnosed more and more with all sorts of disorders. And it just became sort of a question mark, like why are more boys really appearing more in all of these mental health settings, as well as school psychology offices and counseling offices? I took a look at that, and that's what my book was about. And the national picture verifies, in fact, that boys carry the brunt of psychiatric diagnosing, as well as learning disabilities and tutoring and all sorts of support services. The national picture is really quite dramatic. 2 to 3 times more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD, and those diagnoses, they really ballooned, quadrupled, in fact, in a recent 10-year period, beginning in the late 80s. They've now become the #1 pediatric problem in the United States. The 2 to 3 times more likely in boys makes it pretty much a boy disorder, but in clinic settings like in my office or in a school psychology office, we're talking probably more 7 to 8 times more boys. Bipolar diagnosing as well dramatically ballooned, 4,000% in a 10-year period beginning in the early 90s. And again, about 66% diagnosed in males, boys as well as men. So, we're talking about a really clear clinical picture that I think dovetails with what this conference is really about. So then the question is, well what's going on? I want to talk just real briefly about where I think there are some problems with the society right now and the natural development of boys. So I'm just going to lead you through what are just 3 very simple, pretty much respected differences that we find in neonates between boys and girls. And anything I say, of course, there will be girls that do more of this than boys in certain circumstances, but these are sort of group differences that, when averaged, do seem to hold up. 3 things that I think are really happening. The first one is eye contact. From day one, boys don't make as much eye contact as infants or neonates as girls. Listening. It turns out that boys, men in particular as well, it's true for us guys, in a certain range of hearing, it's 1,000 to 4,000 hertz, our hearing is not as acute. Now, we certainly hear, but that's an interesting sort of range because it's where speech discrimination is taking place. It may explain why, by about 1.5 years, girls are about twice ahead of boys on their vocabulary, at about like 80, 90 words to about 40 or 50. And that's like starting a marathon and then halfway in starting the other group. It's an enormous amount of ground to cover. The third is motor activity, or just plain old movement. Even in utero, boys do wiggle, fidget, move more than girls, and that's a pattern that they've seen all through early childhood. So think of those 3. Let's say I'm a little boy and I'm in school and I'm not looking at you and I'm not really listening to as many of the words or processing them at the same rate as, say, the girls are, and I'm not sitting still. What do teachers say all day long? Pretty much to boys, let me see your eyes, you're not listening, please sit still. I mean, I call it the perfect storm of developmental problems as soon as these little guys hit school. It's also true that the bulk of all these diagnoses I'm talking about, they're becoming earlier and earlier, more and more boys, and now they're because teachers are seeing the issues because kids are going into school, as I said earlier. So a lot of it's actually being not necessarily diagnosed, but suggested, and the evaluation process immediately gets rolling. So is that enough? Are those developmental differences right there? You know, they're not huge, but they're known. Are they enough to cause enough problems? Well, let's look at the expulsion rates in the United States, okay? What would you think would be the age group that would be the most expelled group? You'd figure it probably is boys, but you're probably thinking, you know, middle school and up, or scary gangs of kids, you know, wielding knives, or, you know, immediately that's kind of what pops to mind. It must be something very violent and over the top. The largest group of expelled students in the United States are preschoolers. And it turns out 4 to 5 times more likely boys than girls. In other words, boys, hands down, are the most likely group to be kicked out of preschool, or out of all schools, mainly because they're not public, they happen to be private. But think about that. And in my office, I deal with the realities of that, where as soon as many of these little guys who aren't really listening, looking up, attending, and can't keep their motor movements still, often are tagged early and kicked out of their first learning experiences. So then I sort of want to pull the lens back and ask myself, so what's going on here? You know, is there something wrong with the Y chromosome? Is there something? No, it's not that the boys have changed over the last quarter century since I've been doing this. What are the shifts that I've been seeing? And I've been watching this both in my practice and both in the society, and we all sort of feel some of these things. So I want to just lay out maybe 2 or 3 very quickly to think about. One is, we are a society that is moving indoors. If you think about it, we're spending more and more time on electronic devices and technologies that keep us sort of banded inside. When you're outdoors, you move. We're getting less physical activity. There's no couches outside. There's no seats outside generally, unless they're hard like park benches. The outdoors invokes the body to move and to be motivated and to explore. That's not happening indoors. About 7.5 hours a day is the average that American children and teens are spending now on electronic devices, or we'll call them screens. Kaiser Family Foundation, a recent report. Boys, a little bit more than girls, and the boys in particular aren't doing the social media as much as girls are, so they're not even really interacting. They're pulled more into sort of their video gaming. There's also been a significant drop since the 1970s. One researcher points to, since sort of 1981 on, compared to pretty much in the middle part of 2000, about a 25% drop in play, about 12 hours less of free time. This is for children, American children. And the big one is 50% less of outdoor unstructured activities. Once again, thinking about those early developmental things in boys, I need to move, I need to explore, I need to touch. Sort of the idea that those types of things that may be more prominent differences in groups of boys early on are not getting met as early. That may be some of what we're seeing that happens when they enter into their school settings. Another thing I want to talk about is our cultural obsession with metrics. I see the impact on children, and boys in particular. Early on, we want to diagnose. Early on, we want to catch everything as early as possible. The problem is we're terrible at it. We don't diagnose very well in very early ranges of childhood. We think we're catching a problem. What we're doing is we're usually using not terrific measurements and observations. So what we tend to do is we look for a problem, and then we're off to the races with lots of interventions. It may explain these high rates of diagnosing in kids, particularly boys. Teaching to the test. What's very interesting, too, is we have more time in school, more sitting time in school, less recess. Why? Because of the importance of tests that do measurement, both of teacher skills and children's skills, in the educational setting. Well, guess what? We find, one study found, higher rates of ADHD being diagnosed, again, it's going to be mostly in boys, in states that had stricter test performance standards. Sports. I can't tell you how many times in my office I'll have, you know, boys, usually around the time of middle school, just sobbing uncontrollably because why? They can't compete now in sports. If you have a son who's at a certain age level, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. The competition has gotten so severe. It's true for girls as well. But for boys, there's something very primitive that I've seen over the years where it's a really important identity to their sense of mastery, their sense of ability to compete, to be able to use competition, to feel powerful, to use their bodies. And it's a very, very big sort of heroic and also part dream of theirs to just get involved in these sports and participate. Well, you can't anymore. By middle school, the competition is so significant that most kids and boys just can't possibly do it. And it's at that point that they get cut out of the better leagues. And finally, just want to mention quickly, talk about the educational setting itself. It's a predominantly female-oriented run type of organization, if you think about it. And we can't blame women, we have to blame the men. The men aren't showing up. If you think about the number of teachers you might have had when you were younger who who are male, you're probably going to be remembering more high school, or you're going to be remembering maybe middle school. 25% across the board is one statistic I've seen for males in all education. It goes down to about 9% if you look at early elementary. When you go down to preschool and K, you're probably looking at about 2 to 3% are male. And again, if you think about the importance of males in the classroom, part of the learning experience, it's more hands-on, exploratory, a lot more tolerance for movement, things like this. I personally have seen this anecdotally. A lot of parents have talked to me about it. Other clinicians have told me when boys who are more active, boys who need more sort of more rounded sorts of more multidisciplinary, multisensory types of learning, when it's a male teacher, they're a little bit more tolerant of it. Not across the board, but they tend to be. So I'm going to stop there and give it to the next person. But I want to just quickly, again, go back to that original thing to think about, which is little boys and, from what I see, the eye contact, the listening, and the motor movements. Could these, in fact, very early on be what's leading to some of the things we're seeing mushroom way down the road? Thank you.